All right, we're going to take a quick look at the Cold War, which was called the Cold War because the Soviet Union and the United States never actually directly fought each other. One of the reasons they didn't was, of course, the idea that, or not the idea, but the fact that they both possessed nuclear weapons and that any war directly fought between each other would likely result in the end of the world. Cold War began shortly after World War II when the Soviet Union and the United States began to compete for political influence around the world. In areas of Africa, Europe, Central America, both countries were trying to prop up and gain favor and influence by providing aid, money, military weapons, and trying to ensure that the government that was in power was a pro American or pro Soviet government. Containment was simply a policy by President Truman to try to contain the spread of communism. And Americans were so fearful that communism would spread throughout the world, especially in post war Europe. And so the Marshall Plan provided lots of funds to help rebuild Western European countries, and NATO provided a military alliance in order to protect it from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union responded by creating the Warsaw Pact, basically the same idea. It established puppet governments all along Eastern Europe to ensure that it had this buffer zone between it and the rest of Europe. President Churchill at the time of Britain famously coined the phrase, the Iron Curtain that has descended upon Europe. In addition, the Cold War is marked by a period of an arms race. In particular, the Rosenbergs, who were executed for treason, shared nuclear secrets with the Russians, believing that no one country should possess nuclear technology by itself because it could dominate and control the world. This led to an arms race between the Soviets and the Americans, basically creating a situation in which we have mutually assured self-destruction, meaning a direct confrontation was not possible. We have all kinds of examples of this competition between the Soviets and the US, but none probably represents it more than the space race. And there was this huge rush to put a man on the moon. The Soviets were the first to launch a manned mission into orbit around the Earth, creating panic in the United States. And this led to millions of dollars being pumped into NASA so that they could be the first to reach the moon. And once they did, the space race was effectively ended, and the Americans had emerged as victors. We're going to see a series of proxy wars basically being fought during the Cold War. These are wars that are being funded by either the Soviet Union or the United States in order to ensure that it has a friendly government in power. The Americans believed that there was this domino theory, that once one country became communist, it would spread, not unlike the coronavirus, and it would spread to different countries. And so it became involved in conflicts in Asia, such as the Korean War and the Vietnam War. It became heavily involved in Israel. And on the other end, we had the Soviet Union becoming involved in Afghanistan, and both countries secretly supporting and providing military funds and weapons, and in some cases being directly involved in terms of sending troops to try to help fight the war. The Red Scare became something of a period of time in the United States in the 50s and the 60s where Americans truly believed that communists and the Soviets were their enemies, that there were spies everywhere, that every villain and bad guy in every movie was a Russian out to get Americans. And this manifested itself into what was known as McCarthyism. And Senator McCarthy started a series of basically Senate investigations in which they started blacklisting all kinds of people who were supposedly communists, actors, activists. Anyone who spoke out against the government was being labeled a communist, and their reputations were ruined. It also led to a ton of propaganda on both sides. And during this period of time, the government spent a lot of time making Americans afraid of the Soviets. We saw bomb shelters being built, people practicing and preparing for potential nuclear war, neighbors turning in neighbors. And it was a really kind of a tense time during the American history. Now, there was good reason for that. We had moments of brinkmanship all along in the early decades of the Cold War. Brinkmanship being where one country or the other would push things to the point where there would almost be all out war between each other. The first was the Berlin airlift, in which we saw the Soviets block off access to Berlin, and the Americans sending in hundreds of planes bringing in cargo every single day in order to provide West Berlin with the necessary goods that it needed to survive. The most famous of the brinkmanship was, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which the Soviets tried to put nuclear weapons into Cuba right off the coast of the United States, and the Americans forming a blockade and saying that if the Soviets crossed it, it would be a declaration of war and that we would have World War III. For 13 days, the world, and in particular the United States, held its breath preparing for nuclear war. The Berlin airlift, as we mentioned, was when the Soviets blocked off Berlin, or West Berlin, which was under American, British, and French control, leading to the airlift. Once the airlift finally ended the blockade, but then that led to the creation and the building of the Berlin Wall, which became a symbol of the Cold War. As we moved into the 80s, and when I was a student your age, we still lived in fear of a nuclear war. But for the first time, we began to see cracks emerge within the Soviet Union. Building up nuclear arms, building up massive armies, it costs a lot of money. In fact, the U.S. could provide free healthcare for all Americans on less than 0.5% of its military budget. That's how much it spends on the military. Well, during the 80s, we see President Gorbachev emerge as leader of the Soviet Union, and he brings in perestroika and glasnost. This period of openness and economic reform where they tried to allow for greater freedoms for people and tried to allow for greater economic freedoms in terms of capitalism. This isn't going to go well. It's going to end up actually leading to a lot of European communist countries breaking away from the Soviet Union and leading to the end of the USSR. We see the fall of the Berlin Wall. We see other countries declare their independence. And the Soviet Union comes to an end and leads to the formation of the current day Russia, or coalition of independent states. When we look at the timeline of the Cold War, we see massive buildup of nuclear arms. We see buildup of military. We see spending of millions and billions of dollars in propping up wars all over the world. So when we look at the world today and we ask questions like, why is ISIS so anti-American? Why was Al-Qaeda launching an attack on the Twin Towers? Well, the reality is that Al-Qaeda was a group out of Afghanistan that were trained and funded by the Americans to fight against the Soviets during the Afghan War in the late 1970s and early 1980s. However, when the Soviets pulled out, the Americans were like, hey, we're done here. And they walked away, and that left a lot of their so-called allies and friends feeling really bitter and betrayed by the Americans as they were left to pick up the broken pieces of what remained of their country. That bitterness and anger and resentment of American interference in world affairs from the Middle East to Africa to Central America has led to a lot of anti-American sentiment. And that all stemmed from the American policies during the Cold War to try to stop the influence of the Soviet Union.